Alicia, I think we're right at a little minute after 10, and so we can jump in and get started. And if anyone else joins, we'll let them in as they come. But thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you here. We're really
Great.
excited to learn more about your research, so I can turn it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so very much. Jessica, this is an awesome chance to get to talk to you all and actually see some faces and hear some people outside of a computer. So it's great. I'm going to share my screen real quick. And can you see a green screen in the background there?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Great. Um, so my name is Alicia Coleman. I am a PhD student at UMass Amherst. So I'm still a student, which has been lots of fun to keep learning and actually celebrate my 10th year of college. And hopefully I'll be finished soon, but I am working in Massachusetts, so just a little bit south of where you all live. And my research focuses on trees in cities. So that discipline is called urban forestry. But what I look at is not actually the trees themselves. So there's a lot of really cool research that looks at how roots grow, how leaves can help cool down the surrounding environment. But what I actually research is how trees are used by the people that live in cities and how those trees are actually taken care of by those people. So not about the trees themselves, but all of the people and all of the different groups that work together to make sure that our trees are happy and healthy and stay alive and can work for us the best that they can. So, oops, let's see. Okay. So like I said, urban forestry, working in cities makes it sound a little bit simple. I guess if like 30% of the entire world is covered with forests, cities only create only like this tiny 2% land area of the entire globe. Which means that we're dealing with these smaller spaces, then we're not, I'm not looking at all of the different forests and wildlands that are, covering most of the earth. But the complicated part is that all places are different, right? There's different weather in different places, there's different buildings in different places, there's different ways that people have created cities over time. Some cities are really old, some cities are really new. So it's really interesting to think about cities as almost like their own type of ecosystem in themselves, where we're not just looking at wildlife and trees that have planted and grown on their own, but we're really looking at how people have been, really the major deciding factor and the big decision makers in the way that trees are grown and taken care of. Okay, so the most important, I think, thing to know about trees in cities is that most of the trees aren't like in a forest. They grow out in the wild and more in wide open spaces. But in more suburban and urban places, most of the trees live in neighborhoods and on private property, which means that your neighbors and families and people that you live next to are all the main managers and the main caretaker of these trees, which is really cool to think about how, there's so many different houses and so many different buildings that, are I guess, create or working together in a city to take care of this common resource that we have, which is about trees. Okay. So I wanted to just first, I guess, step back and tell you about what brought me to this research. So I grew up in New Jersey, which is, quite a bit south from here. And the forests where I grew up were called the Pine Barrens. And it all looks really similar to this picture. Lots of pine trees, lots of scrubby undergrowth, and that's about it. And when I was younger and playing around in these woods, I thought, okay, this is all basically the same, right? All of these trees look the same, pretty much all the bushes look the same. It's great that it's here, but it's pretty much all in one the same. until I started learning a bit more about these forests in college and seeing how the ecology and the ecosystems actually change the way that these trees can grow and the way that these trees can just adapt to their environment over time. So when I was, younger, I was looking at forests like this, and then I learned that this specific type of forest called a pygmy pine forest actually can't grow much taller than what you see here, even though it's the same trees that we see here, due to wildfire and lots of other genetic mutations over time. These trees, even though they're the same as the ones that we see in the other picture, they can only grow a certain height. And I was like, wow, that's really cool that even though all of these things that look the same can actually be really different depending on the environment that they grow in and the things that have happened and changed how these trees are able to grow over time. So that got me thinking just how forests and trees and these things that we see growing spontaneously out in the wild are really different when they grow in different conditions, and especially based on cities and based on different things that are happening around where these things are growing. So I wanted to next just talk about how these forests and trees between cities and woodlands and those wide open spaces are similar and how they can be a bit different, okay? So as you see to the left, that's what we see normally when we think of a forest, or what we see when we look outside and when we want to get away and go into nature. Just lots of beautiful trees gathered together. And to the right, it's what we'd expect when we think of New York City or Boston or Portland. It's, lots of cars with only a little bit of trees. So I wanted to talk about where the most similar parts of these is what they call the overstory, or all of the above ground places or parts of the trees that are closest to the sky. So pretty much the same between cities and the forests, mostly used by birds, mostly used by flying insects and bugs, mostly used by things that can crawl up and down a tree, like squirrels and other small mammals. So it's really interesting that, obviously people can't really use the upper parts of trees in either cities or forests, and this area is mostly contained and mostly used by wildlife. But when we get to the bottom part, that's what's really interesting, is this understory. In forests, we expect to see lots of little shrubs and mammals, what they call leaf litter, and just little fungi. And then in cities, we have trash cans to contain our litter. We have people carrying flowers, not necessarily growing flowers very easily, or as easily as they would on the forest floor. And instead of, animals kind of milling about and parking themselves on the forest floor to eat their lunch, we have cars that like to park and stay in cities. So it's really cool to think that, cities and trees or the trees in cities are mostly used by people. And yes, there are tons and tons of wildlife and, other ecological benefits of having trees in cities. But the biggest difference is that the trees in the cities are most largely used by people. Okay, so there's quite a few other differences between trees that live in a forest versus trees that live in the city. And first things first, the planting, and who does the planting is quite different. In forests, we would expect the wind to disperse seeds, or animals to, maybe poop out some seeds, or in the case of logging and lumber, people and machines will be planting trees in very specific places. But in cities, large and large, we need people to do all of the planting. These trees will be quite a bit larger, but still kind of look like sticks. But we wouldn't expect to see the small saplings and the small pine tree that you see to the left, just growing on its own in the city. We really need people to be the ones taking that effort and planting the trees in the ground. Next, the big difference is the amount of growing space. I'm sure you've learned about ecosystems and habitat is similar through school, and a big difference between forests and cities is the actual amount of space that trees can grow, which helps determine the types of trees that can grow in these different places. So to the left, you see, what we think of when we think of a forest. There's lots of space around, even enough space for other small ferns and other small shrubs in that understory to grow next to these trees. But pretty much everyone can move around and grow as big as they can because there's enough space for everyone to live and to grow. But in cities, you'll see there's about, that large, hundreds of foot wide space that you have available in the forest is constrained all the way down to just a couple feet, like you see in the middle of the roadway here. So the types of trees that can grow in cities is inevitably very different than what can grow in forests, largely due to the amount of space that they're able to grow. And next, and lastly, who takes care of the trees are very different. So again, in the forest, we expect just nature to take its course and for trees to take care of themselves over time. They grow and mature and maybe compete with other trees. They get as big as they can, and then they fall over and decompose down into the soil, and we can start the next generation of trees all over again. But in cities, unfortunately, it's not that easy. Usually we need about 4 or 5 years of people taking care of trees very intensely after they've been planted in cities, usually with the help of people like this nice municipal worker just giving a tree a nice drink of water after it's been planted. Or there are some really interesting, what they call here gator bags, where you can fill up this bag that's attached to the base of a tree with water so that the water can slowly trickle down over time. But it's just really interesting that there's so much extra work that needs to be put into younger trees that are planted in cities compared to those that are in forests that can just almost take care of themselves over time. Okay, so like I said, the major differences between, I guess, what they call regular forestry and the work that I do in cities is who's doing the planting, whereas in regular forests, nature does some more of the planting, or if we're working with lumber or logging, sometimes people are doing the planting. And in cities, we need lots of people and lots of manpower to do a lot of the hard work and a lot of the hard labor. There's different amounts of planting space and really growing space. And the people that are the things that take care of the maintenance and long-term care of the trees is different. Where in cities, we need lots of people and lots of attention given to the trees. Whereas in forests, things usually take care of themselves. All right, so now I want to talk about how trees are used in cities. So again, my research isn't as much about the different parts of a tree and how they grow or change or just adapt to different things over time, but how people who live in cities like to use trees and what they mean to those people. And the number one reason that we always hear about, and the most, I guess, valued part of trees in cities, is shade. Not only because it's super cool, literally cool, and then physically cool in the summertime. I think there's a couple degrees difference when you stand under a shaded tree versus that of a street that's not shaded. But also just the appearance of a nice shade tree casting a shadow over a sidewalk and over different parts of an urban property. People like how this looks and how just comforting it is to not only have a nice shaded area, but just this beautiful canopy of trees over a sidewalk. Which leads to the next greatest reason why trees are used in cities: to protect sidewalks, which is kind of strange to think about. But when trees are planted in between a sidewalk and a road, some research has shown that drivers actually slow down their speed, so people are able to just to drive more safely because they're protected by trees on either side, and there's a more narrow space where they can drive. but also that means for the people walking on the sidewalk that there's more distance between them and the road. So people can stay further away from traffic, have a beautiful tree next to them, and the cars on the other side can drive a bit safer. And the next most important thing that trees in cities are used for is to carry rainwater away. So unlike forests where rainwater just kind of trickles down the soil and permeates and fills up the water table on its own, trees in cities are really useful to help move all of the stormwater and rainwater away from flooding and all of our different homes and businesses and all of the things that are working in cities. But usually that requires some extra work. So this crazy diagram on the right shows how there's really specific soils and really specific, I guess, rain moving networks that need to be in place in order for rain to work or to get out of the way of the city streets. But trees are a really important place and a really important, I guess, factor in moving rainwater out of cities. And lastly, views of nature outside of our windows are really one of the most valued parts of having trees in cities. There are tons and tons of studies going way back that show that people that are recovering after surgeries in hospitals actually get better faster when they have views of nature and views of trees growing outside of the windows. There's tons of other studies that show that we are in a better mood and we generally feel better when we see trees and we see greenery outside of our windows. And that's really important in cities because we don't expect to have lots of big expanses of forests, just hanging out right next to where we live. So when there's a tree that's planted right outside of our window, you're given the chance to have that nice benefit of nature just right outside where you live without needing to go very far. Okay, so what do we actually research if we're not actually looking at the trees themselves and how they grow or change through the seasons or anything like that? So what my research does is looks at what gets people excited to be part of different tree planting, what they call campaigns or tree planting programs, where lots of trees are planted at one time in a city because the government is excited to plant the trees, or somehow the community has gotten together and is really stoked to plant some trees. So what my research does is looks at what gets people excited to either volunteer or to actually start working on behalf of planting trees. Is it because they think it's the right thing to do and because it's something that's really important to them? Is it something that they were inspired by because of climate change and because of all of these, other environmental issues that they see either locally or at a global scale? So it's really interesting to think of what inspires people to be involved in trees without actually maybe even having a background in science like I do. I don't have any I'm not a biologist or an ecologist. I study people. So it's cool to be involved and to think about what gets people excited about trees and the environment without actually being in the physical sciences. So here's some of the questions that we like to answer. And for my, what they call the dissertation and my big project that I have to do at the end of my degree, these are some of the questions that I am trying to answer. And I do so through talking to people on the street. So because I'm studying people, I get the chance to talk with people in person so that they can answer surveys and answer other questions about what gets them excited about trees. So like I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we know that trees do in cities is that they protect people on the sidewalk. So I actually want to know if and how trees make people feel safer on the sidewalk. Do those trees need to be really big and really mature to have a bigger, I guess, trunk and a bigger, barrier between them and the road? Or are small trees enough? You know, are these new trees that are planted, are they helping people feel safer on the roads in any way? I'm also looking at the types of different trees that are being planted as part of these big tree planting programs. So different trees, you know, I'm sure we know, provide different things. So shade trees tend to get bigger and taller and provide wonderful amounts of shade and cooling in a city. But then people can sometimes get flowering trees that stay smaller and look beautiful in the springtime. Or people can get fruiting trees that produce apples and other, you know, types of fruits that we can eat. So I'm curious to know what gets people excited about planting these particular types of trees for their own homes, because they will be the people looking at them every day and taking care of them all the time. So it's important to know what gets them excited for these different types of trees. And then that leads into my last question. So when we're planting trees or thinking about people who want to plant trees in their yard, we have to be worried, I guess, about what they call the establishment period, or that 3 years, 3 to 5 years, when trees are first starting to take root into the ground and really need the most attention and care. And I guess it's kind of like having a little baby or a puppy or some kind of young pet or young child at home, where in these early years they need the most attention, because that will ultimately affect how they can grow and thrive and stay healthy in the future. So it's a big commitment when you're taking on a new tree that sometimes people aren't prepared for. You have to water them quite a few times a week. You have to keep them mulched and put some protection on top of them to keep the moisture in the roots. Sometimes you need to prune trees and prune some bad limbs off of trees. So there's a lot of things to do, and sometimes it's hard to be prepared to know what to do if you don't know how to do it. So it's interesting to know when people are excited to take on and to be ready to take care of a new tree in their yard. We want to know how much they know about tree care, and that will ultimately affect how trees grow in the long term. So with that, I'm gonna close it out. I know that was a lot of information. I'll have to say that the best part about doing tree research and talking to people and getting surveys on the streets is getting them excited to take our snacks because they are always just really glad to help out. But then it's even better when they come up and they're like, "Oh, hey, can I have some snacks?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, do you want to talk to us about your trees?" So it's lots of fun. And yeah, I would love to talk with you all now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was super interesting, and we already have a couple of questions here in the
Okay.
chat. One question that people have is how long does it usually take to actually plant a tree?
Ooh, okay. So let's see. So that's a really good question. So I guess we have to think about picking up a tree from a nursery. Okay. So trees in cities are usually grown first, not in the wild, but in these garden centers and nurseries. So you have to first get the tree from the nursery to the planting site. And then you have to dig a big hole. So usually about 2 times the size of the bottom root ball of the tree. You dig that out. That probably takes probably takes about an hour or so to get to the site. Probably takes about, depending, probably about 20 minutes or so to dig a big hole. Then you start filling in the hole with the tree, and then different layers of water and soil, so that the soil starts to settle on top and it starts to get watered right away. And then it's really interesting. So then on top, once all of the tree ball is covered with soil, they usually build up these different soil mounds around the tree so that water can actually stay pooled in the bottom part of a tree without overflowing on the side. So they create, I think, what they call a berm, and these little just like a little containment area for the water. And I feel like that takes the longest. So maybe all in all, about an hour to plant a single tree, but you have to be really attentive to all of those specific steps so that the tree can be healthy over time. Good question.
Yeah, that's a awesome answer too. You wouldn't know that there's more than just digging a hole and having to plant it. So that's
Oh
really
yeah,
cool.
yep, yep.
Then we have a class who's wondering how many trees do you think you personally have planted?
Oh man. Well, I started planting trees for Arbor Day actually in elementary school. I remember the first tree planting. I think it was a smaller flowering tree that we planted in the yard at my school. I think it was at recess. It was so much fun. So I planted that one. I think I've helped plant a few, but I'm not the main digger person and I'm not the main tree planting person. So all in all, let's see, probably about 20 and all in different places too. So where I grew up in New Jersey, I've planted some. I planted some in Philadelphia when I went to school there. I planted some in Massachusetts when I've worked up there. So it's cool that you can plant trees in different places and then kind of have them grow all in different parts of the world and kind of leave your personal touch on them. Yeah, really good question.
Yeah. Then we have two different questions, but I'm gonna kind of combine them. We have one class who's wondering, do they plant apple trees in cities? And then another class who's wondering what trees do they plant the most usually when they do this type of project.
Oh, so interesting. Okay, so I'll answer the first one first. We can plant apple trees in cities if there's enough space around them. So remember, I was saying that, we can't always grow those big and the best trees in between or near sidewalks or near roadways just because the trees don't have enough space for their roots to grow and for them to be healthy and to produce apples over time. So I think they do plant it for these programs. They do plant apple trees in people's yards or in parks when there is enough growing space. Um, but then the next question about the most popular types of trees that are grown is really interesting because there isn't one answer because we want to increase what they call the diversity or the biodiversity of the tree species and the different types of trees that are grown in cities. Because unfortunately, when only one type of tree is planted or there's too many of the same type of trees in a similar area, if a pest comes around or a certain fungus comes and just infects that one particular tree, all of them will be infected at the same time, all of them will die at the same time, and then we don't have any trees left, and it's just a big mess. So when they're planning these planting programs, and they call it tree planning, not tree planting. So all of the prep work that's done before the planting actually happens, they take a really good look at all of the different species that are already planted in and growing in those particular parts of the city, and they try and change it up and they try and add as many new types of species as they can to that area. So I know that's not a great question or a great answer, but that was a really good question because that's one of the most important parts of all of these urban forestry programs is to increase the species diversity within the tree populations.
Yeah, that is super cool.
Yeah.
Then we have a group who's wondering, how long have you been studying trees for?
Oh, yeah. So it's so interesting. So much of what I've learned and what's been inspiring came to me while I was still younger and in school. So my mom liked to feed the animals outside when I was younger, and I got to learn that squirrels run up and down trees and will fight each other for different foods. But in school, I started learning about trees and studying them. I guess my freshman year of college, my freshman or sophomore year, I took a really cool ecology class that focused on ecosystems and how species are distributed in different places all around the world. So that's what really hooked me in. I was like, oh, okay, this whole thing called ecology and looking at trees specifically is awesome. But I wasn't on a track to study the biology of trees or more of the physiology of trees. I was on a program to actually to study people and look at psychology and sociology and all of these different social systems. Um, so when I started looking around and realizing that you can help trees and help the environment by studying people, I was like, oh, this is perfect. I love trees, and I'm, not trained to do all of the, what they call the usual sciences, the physical sciences, but I can still continue learning about trees and how people take care of them through the social sciences. So it's been, I would say it's a lifelong endeavor, but most practically, I guess, about 10 years.
That is super cool. Then I know you just said you don't specifically study trees, but you might know this or you might not, and that's okay.
Mhm.
But one class is wondering, in the forest, how do smaller plants under trees get sunlight and how are they able to grow?
Oh, that is such a good question. Yeah. So it's different, of course, in different parts of the world with different weather and how warm it stays and how much, how much time the leaves are off of the trees. Um, but there's all of the plants in the forest have adapted and evolved to grow alongside the bigger trees that they live next to. So those smaller plants usually are just by their own nature and through their own adaptations over time. And by time, we mean hundreds and thousands of years. So season after season, they've learned and taught themselves how to grow with smaller amounts of light. So usually that's why, there's some, I guess what they call more typical plants that you see in the understory of a forest, like ferns and smaller shrubs that sometimes stay green all year and sometimes lose their leaves. But they've, I guess, just adjusted themselves over time and have taught themselves to not need a lot of light.
Yeah, that is super cool.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
we have somebody wondering, do they always get trees from like a nursery or somewhere like that, or do they ever go out into the forest to find small trees and relocate them?
Oh my gosh, that is such a good question. So usually for these bigger programs where they're not only planting one or two trees, but they're planting thousands and thousands of trees at a time, or planning to plant thousands of trees, they are usually gotten from a nursery. But that doesn't mean that the nursery just, you know, picks out any random tree to grow. They sometimes select seeds that are native and start growing the trees from native populations so that the trees themselves are similar to what they would find in a forest or similar to what naturally grows in the region. But those trees are, I guess, taken care of and given a lot of attention as from the time that they're saplings all the way to their, I guess, later maturity, from when they're until they're ready to be planted in the ground in cities. Um, and I guess it would, so that they do it out of, they do it that way, I guess, out of convenience of having just all of the trees growing and, they're taken care of all in one place to then be transplanted into the ground. They, I guess, in some cases could transplant from a forest, but that would be pretty disruptive for the tree itself, and then as well as everything else that's growing around a tree in the forest. So they're generally like to keep those trees and let them do their thing out in the forest and then kind of grow their own in a nursery, just so that they can keep an eye on them a bit better. Really good question.
Awesome. Then we have a group who's wondering, what happens if no one takes care of the trees in the city after they're planted?
Oof, yeah. So a couple things could happen. Um, Best case scenario, the tree is hardy, it is perseveres, it has enough space, and it maybe if it's rained a bit through that summer, through the growing season, it can survive. Maybe it wouldn't be as healthy as it could be or grow as much as it could be if it was given all of the attention that, we were typically giving to these young trees. But in the best case scenario, it would still survive and, it'd grow up to be a happy and healthy tree. But in the worst case scenario, will die. And that is what we call standing dead trees. So unfortunately, that what I called the establishment period, or those first couple of years, are just super important for the roots to take hold and to really adjust to living in a really stressful urban environment, surrounded by concrete and surrounded by people and all of these different things, just kind of making it more difficult for it to survive. And if those conditions are just way too stressful for a tree to be able to get through, then it will unfortunately die and just kind of look like a stick in the ground. And sometimes those are removed and then replaced, and then people try again. Or other times the space is just left vacant, and then no more trees are able to go there.
Yeah, that definitely a wide range of options or stuff.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Then we have a group who's wondering, what's your favorite part about planting trees or other people planting trees and that whole process?
I think I love watching people work together to plant these trees, because no one of these different community groups or governments or even households can do all of this work on their own. It all needs to be done by talking with each other and by figuring out what the best tree to plant in your particular yard is, or in this small spaces. And during the tree planting days, it's really fun to see neighbors and people that usually wouldn't talk to each other come together and plant a tree and really just really be inspired by the changes that they're making in their own backyard. And not just for themselves, but for everyone that lives around them too. I think that's my favorite part, is just watching how everyone is together.
Yeah, must be really cool to watch the whole process happen.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
Um, we also have a student who's wondering, what is the coolest thing you have learned from your research so far?
Oh, so far, I think the coolest thing is how everyone can look at a tree, so we can all look at the same tree, and it can mean something different for any of us, just depending on where we grew up and what's most familiar with us, with what we've looked at. Or maybe someone has had a significant experience with tree planting in the past, so it just reminds them of maybe where of their family or of that special event, or working with their neighbors. I think that's been the coolest thing, is that trees are, even when they all look the same, they mean different things to different people, just based on our experiences with them.
That is super cool. Then we have somebody wondering, when are you done with this research, and do you know what you'd want to do for your next research project yet?
Ooh, so exciting. Yeah, so I'm hoping to finish with this part of the research maybe in May or June. So all of these projects, of course, school takes a really long time. So these projects have been like 3 years in the making. So I'm hoping to finish them up within the next 6 months or so. And then it kind of depends. Sometimes the after PhD options are just so contingent on different funding and different just opportunities that are available, that we usually don't know about until they get closer. But one project that has come up is looking at just all the things that I've been talking about, just how different stewardship, or what they call tree care is called stewardship, how people, as long-term stewardship of trees actually affects tree health over time. So that would be going into cities to track how healthy the trees are, and to track who has been taking care of those particular trees over time, to see if there's a relationship between people's interest and long-term attention and care of the trees to how healthy and productive the tree is. So that would be a cool one. I hope I could get that one.
Yeah, I hope we can too. That would be awesome.
Thanks.
And then I think we have time for one more
Okay.
question here, and we have someone wondering, what is your favorite type of tree and why?
Oh, so I guess talking about experiences and what makes trees meaningful to people, I'd have to say that my favorite tree is the pitch pine that I grew up with in New Jersey. And it's not one that can really grow super well in cities. It needs really sandy soil. It needs like these really stressful conditions. Oh, so maybe then it would grow well in cities. It needs these really stressful, acidic soil that's basically sand to grow in. I think it's just so cool because of um, how adapted it is to live in such severe conditions. So that's my favorite tree. I guess my favorite tree in a city, though, it's something called a honey locust. It's also a really durable tree. It grows pretty big, pretty fast, and it has these long, like what looks like fronds of a fern. So it looks like these big ferns just kind of coming out of the tree. It's really good to help clean out air pollution. It's really durable. So I guess so honey locust reminds me of the trees where I grew up that are really stressed out.
That is really cool, and everything was really cool. We really appreciate you joining us today and
Yeah.
teaching us all about so many different things that I've never considered, so maybe some other people haven't either, and I learned a lot of new things, but we appreciate you taking the time to join us, and I appreciate all the students and teachers in classrooms joining us to ask us some really awesome questions.
Yeah, those questions were really amazing. Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming, everyone, and we will see you all soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.